Well, if we can apply that style of empathy, style of curiosity to the current war in Ukraine, what is your understanding of why Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022?
Vladimir Putin could have avoided the war in the Ukraine. His invasion was illegal, it was unnecessary, and it was brutal. But I think it's important for us to move beyond these kind of comic book depictions of of this insane, avaricious Russian leader who wants to, restore the Soviet Empire, and that's why, and who made an unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine. He was provoked, and we were provoking him, for since 1997. And it's not just me that's saying that. I mean, before Putin ever came in, we were provoking the Russians in this way unnecessarily. And to go back that time in 1992, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Russians moved out of East Germany. And they did that, which was a huge concession to them. They had 400,000 troops in East Germany at that time, and they were facing NATO troops on the other side of the wall. So Gorbachev made this huge concession where he said to George Bush, I'm going to move all of our troops out, and you can then reunify Germany under NATO, which was a hostile army to the Soviet. It was created to, with hostile intent toward the Soviet Union. And he said, you can take Germany, but I want your promise that you will not move NATO to the east. And James Baker, who was his Secretary of State, famously said, I will not move NATO. We will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. So then 5 years later, in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was kind of the father of the neocons, who was a Democrat at that time, served in the Carter administration, he said he published a paper, a blueprint for moving NATO right up to the Russian border, 1,000 miles to the east, and taking over 14 nations. And at that time, George Kennan, who was the kind of the deity of American diplomats, he was probably arguably the most important diplomat in American history. He was the architect of the containment policy during World War II. And he said, this is insane and it's unnecessary. And if you do this, it's going to provoke the Russians to a violent response. And we should be making friends with the Russians. They lost the Cold War. We should be treating them the way that we treated our adversaries after World War II, like with a Marshall Plan to try to help them incorporate into Europe and to be part of the brotherhood of man and of Western nations. We shouldn't continue to be treating them as an enemy and particularly surrounding them at their borders. William Perry, who was then the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, threatened to resign. He was so upset by this plan to move NATO to the east. And William Burns, who was then the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who's now, at this moment, the head of the CIA, said at that time the same thing. If you do this, it is going to provoke the Russians toward a military response. And we moved it. We moved all around Russia. We moved to 14 nations, 1,000 miles to the east. And we put Aegis missile systems in 2 nations in Romania and Poland. So we did what the Russians had done to us in 1962 that would have provoked an invasion of Cuba. We put those missile systems back there, and then we walk away unilaterally, from the 2 nuclear missile treaties, the intermediate nuclear missile treaties that we had with Russia. And neither of us would put those missile systems on the borders. We walk away from that, and we put Aegis missile systems, which are nuclear capable. They can carry the Tomahawk missiles, which have nuclear warheads. So the last country that they didn't take was the Ukraine. And the Russians said, and in fact, Bill Perry said this, or William Burns said it, so now the head of the CIA, it is a red line. If we bring NATO into Ukraine, that is a red line for the Russians. They cannot live with it. Russia has been invaded. 3 times through the Ukraine. The last time it was invaded, the Germans killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. They destroyed. My uncle described what happened to Russia in his famous American University speech in 1963, 60 years ago this month, or last month, 60 years ago in June 10th, 1963. He told that speech was telling the American people, put yourself in the shoes of the Russians. We need to do that if we're gonna make peace. And he said, all of us have been taught, that we won the war, but we didn't win the war. The Russians, if anybody won the war against Hitler, it was the Russians. Their country was destroyed. All of their cities, and he said, imagine if all of the cities from the East Coast of Chicago were reduced to rubble and all of the fields burned, all of the forests burned. That's what happened to Russia. That's what they gave so that we could get rid of Adolf Hitler. And he had them put themselves in their position. And, today there's none of that happening. We have refused repeatedly to talk to the Russians. We've broken up. There's 2 treaties, the Minsk agreements, which the Russians were willing to sign. And they said, we will stay out. The Russians didn't want the Ukraine. They showed that when the Donbass region voted 90-10 to leave and go to Russia. Putin said, no. We want Ukraine to stay intact, but we want you to sign a Minsk Accords the Russians were very worried because of the U.S. involvement in the coup in Ukraine in 2014. And then the oppression and the killing of 14,000 ethnic Russians. And Russia has the same way that if Mexico put Aegis missile systems from China or Russia on our border and then killed 14,000 expats Americans, we would go in there. Oh, he does have a national security interest in the Ukraine. He has an interest in protecting the Russian-speaking people of the Ukraine, the ethnic Russians, and the Minsk Accords did that. It left Ukraine as part of Russia. It left them as a semi-autonomous region that could continue to use their own language, which is essentially banned by the coup, by the government we put in 2014. And we sabotaged that agreement. And we now know in April of 2022, Zelensky and Putin had inked a deal already to another peace agreement, and that the United States sent Boris Johnson, the neocons in the White House sent Boris Johnson over to the Ukraine to sabotage that agreement. So what do I think? I think this is a proxy war. I think this is a war that the neocons in the White House wanted. They've said for 2 decades they wanted this war, and that they wanted to use Ukraine as a pawn in a proxy war between United States and Russia, the same as we used Afghanistan. And in fact, they say it. This is the model. Let's use the Afghanistan model. That was said again and again. And to get the Russians to overextend their troops and then fight them using local fighters and U.S. weapons. And when President Biden was asked, why are we in the Ukraine, he was honest. He says to depose Vladimir Putin, regime change for Vladimir Putin. And when his Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in April 2022 was asked, why are we there? He said to degrade the Russians' capacity to fight anywhere, to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight elsewhere in the world. That's not a humanitarian mission. That's not what we were told. We were told this was an unprovoked invasion, and that we're there to bring a humanitarian relief to the Ukrainians. But that is the opposite. That is a war of attrition that is designed to chew up, to turn this little nation into an abattoir of death for the flower of Ukrainian youth in order to advance a geopolitical ambition of certain people within the White House. And, I think that's wrong. We should be talking to the Russians the way that, Nixon talked to Brezhnev, the way that Bush talked to Gorbachev, the way that my uncle talked to Khrushchev. We need to be talking with the Russians. We should, and negotiating. And we need to be looking about how do we end this and preserve peace in Europe.
Would you, as president, sit down and have a conversation with Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky separately and together to negotiate
Absolutely.
peace?
Absolutely.
What about Vladimir Putin? He's been in power since 2000. So, as the old adage goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Do you think he has been corrupted by being in power for so long? If you think of the man, if you look at his mind.
Listen, I don't know exactly. I can't say because I don't know enough about him or about the evidence that I've seen is that he is homicidal. He kills his enemies or poisons them. And, the reaction I've seen to that, to hit those accusations from him, have not been to deny that, but to kind of laugh it off. I think he's a dangerous man, and that, of course, there's probably corruption in his regime. But having said that, it's not our business to change the Russian government. And anybody who thinks it's a good idea to do regime change in Russia, which has more nuclear weapons than we do, is, I think, irresponsible. And, Vladimir Putin himself has said, we will not live in a world without Russia. And it was clear when he said that he was talking about himself. And he has his hand on a button that could bring, Armageddon to the entire planet. So why are we messing with this? It's not our job to change that regime. And we should be making friends with the Russians. We shouldn't be treating them as an enemy. Now we've pushed them into the camp with China. That's not a good thing for our country. And by the way, what we're doing now does not appear to be weakening Putin at all. Putin now, if you believe the polls that are coming out of Russia, they show him, the most recent polls that I've seen show him with an 89% popularity that people in Russia support the war in Ukraine, and they support him as an individual. So, and I understand there's problems with polling, and you don't know what to believe, but the polls consistently show that, and it's not America's business to be the policeman of the world and to be changing regimes in the world. That's illegal. We shouldn't be breaking international laws. We should actually be looking for ways to improve relationships with Russia, not to destroy Russia, not to destroy, and not to choose its leadership for them. That's up to the Russian people, not us.
So, step one is to sit down and empathize with the leaders of both nations to understand their history, their concerns, their hopes. Just to open the door for conversation so they're not back to the corner.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. can play a really important role, and a U.S. president can play a really important role by reassuring the Russians that we're not going to consider them an enemy anymore, that we want to be friends. And it doesn't mean that you have to let down your guard completely. The way that you do it, which was the way President Kennedy did it, is you do it one step at a time. You take baby steps. We do a unilateral move to reduce our hostility and aggression, and see if the Russians reciprocate. And that's the way that we should be doing it. And we should be easing our way into a positive relationship with Russia. We have a lot in common with Russia, and we should be friends with Russia and with the Russian people. And apparently there's been 350,000 Ukrainians who have died at least in this war, and there's probably been 60 or 80,000 Russians, and that should not give us any joy. It should not give us any. I saw Lindsey Graham on TV saying, anything we can, something to the extent that anything we can do to kill Russians is a good use of our money. That it is not. Those are somebody's children. We should have compassion for them. This war is an unnecessary war. We should settle it through negotiation, through diplomacy, through statecraft, and not through weapons.
Do you think this war can come to an end purely through military operations?
No, I mean, I don't think there's any way in the world that the Ukrainians can beat the Russians. I don't think there's any appetite in Europe. I think Europe is now, in having severe problems in Germany, Italy, France. You're seeing these riots. There's internal problems in those countries. There is no appetite in Europe for sending men to die in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians do not have anybody left. The Ukrainians are using press gangs to fill the ranks of their armies. Men, military age men, are trying as hard as they can to get out of the Ukraine right now to avoid going to the front. The Russians apparently have been killing Ukrainians at a 7-to-1 ratio. My son fought over there, and he told me it's artillery. He had firefights with the Russians mainly at night, but he said most of the battles were artillery wars during the day, and the Russians now outgun the NATO forces 10-to-1 in artillery. Oh, they're killing at a horrendous rate. Now, my interpretation of what's happened so far is that Putin actually went in early on with a small force because he expected to meet somebody on the other end of a negotiating table that once he went in. And that when that didn't happen, they did not have a large enough force to be able to mount an offensive. And so they've been building up that force up till now, and they now have that force. And even against this small original force, the Ukrainians have been helpless. All of their offenses have died. They've now killed, the head of the Ukrainian special forces, which was probably, arguably, by many accounts, the best elite military unit in all of Europe. The commandant, the commander of that special forces group, gave a speech about 4 months ago, saying that 86% of his men are dead or wounded and cannot return to the front. He cannot rebuild that force. The troops that are now headed, that are now filling the gaps of all those 350,000 men who've been lost, are scantily trained, and they're arriving green at the front. Many of them do not want to be there. Many of them are giving up and going over the Russian side. We've seen this again and again and again, including platoon-sized groups that are defecting to the Russians. And I don't think it's possible to win. And anybody, of course, I've studied World War II history exhaustively, but I saw there's a new, I think it's a Netflix series of documentaries that I highly recommend to people. They're colorized versions of the black and white films from the battles of World War II, but it's all the battles of World War II. So I watched Stalingrad the other night, and the willingness of the Russians to fight on against any kind of odds and to make huge sacrifices of Russians, the Russians themselves, who were making the sacrifice with their lives, the willingness of them to do that for their motherland is almost inexhaustible. It is incomprehensible to think that that Ukraine can beat Russia in a war. It would be like Mexico beating the United States. It's impossible to think that it can happen. And, Russia has deployed a tiny, tiny fraction of its military so far. And, now it has China with its mass production capacity supporting its war effort. It's a hopeless situation, and we've been lied to. We're the press in our country and our government are just promoting this lie that the Ukrainians are about to win and that everything's going great and that Putin's on the run, and there's all this wishful thinking because of the Wagner group, the Prigozhin and the Wagner group, that this was an internal coup and it showed dissent and weakness of Putin, and none of that is true. That insurgency, which wasn't even an insurgency, he only got 4,000 of his men to follow him out of 20,000. and they were quickly stopped, and nobody in the Russian military, the oligarchy, the political system, nobody supported it, but we're being told, oh yeah, it's the beginning of the end for Putin. He's weakened, he's wounded, he's on his way out, and all of these things are just lies that we are being fed.
So to
And
push back on a small aspect of this that you kind of implied. So I've traveled to Ukraine, and one thing that I should say, similar to the Battle of Stalingrad, it is just not. It is not only the Russians that fight to the end. I think Ukrainians are very willing to fight to the end, and the morale there is quite high. I've talked to nobody. This was a year ago in August with her son. Everybody was proud to fight and die for their country, and there's some aspect where this war unified the people, gave them a reason and an understanding that this is what it means to be Ukrainian, and I will fight to the death to defend this land.
I would agree with that, and I should have said that myself at the beginning. That's one of the reasons my son went over there to fight, because he was inspired by the valor of the Ukrainian people and this extraordinary willingness of them. And I think Putin thought it would be much easier to sweep into Ukraine, and he found a stone wall of Ukrainians, whether ready to put their lives and their bodies on the line. But that, to me, makes the whole episode even more tragic. Is that I don't believe I think that the U.S. role in this has been that there were many opportunities to settle this war, and the Ukrainians wanted to settle it. Vladimir Zelensky, when he ran in 2019, here's a guy who's a comedian. He's an actor. He had no political experience, and yet he won this election with 70% of the vote. Why? He won on a peace platform. And he won promising to sign the Minsk Accords. And yet something happened when he got in there that made him suddenly pivot. And, I think it's a good guess what happened. I think he came under threat by ultra nationalists within his own administration. And the insistence of neocons like Victoria Nuland in the White House that, we don't want peace with Putin. We want a war.
Do you worry about nuclear war?
Yeah, I worry about it. It
seems like a silly question, but it's not. It's a serious question.
Well, the reason it's not, the reason it's not is just because people seem to be in this kind of dream state about that it'll never happen. And yet, it can happen very easily, and it can happen at any time. And, if we push the Russians too far, I don't doubt that Putin, if he felt like his regime was or his nation was in danger, that the United States was going to be able to place, a Quisling on, into the Kremlin, that he would use nuclear, torpedoes. These strategic weapons that they have, and that could be once you do that, nobody controls the trajectory.